Hi, everyone. For my contemporary crisis analysis, I will be discussing the immigration enforcement operations that began in Los Angeles area in June of 2025. My presentation focuses specifically on how these raids affected immigrant workers, Latino communities, mixed status families, children, schools, and community organizations. Although immigrant enforcement is not new, the scale and tactics of these operations, combined with the protests and military response that followed, created a temporary crisis at the micro, meso, and macro levels. I will first provide context about the event and populations affected. I will then apply Roberts' seven-stage crisis intervention model, critique the response through a DEIA and human rights lens, and conclude with a culturally responsive intervention plan. My main argument is that this crisis cannot be understood solely as a disagreement about immigration policy. It must also be examined as a community-wide crisis involving fear, family separation, economic destabilization, racialized surveillance, unequal access to legal protections, and declining trust in public institutions. So first, we're going to start with context of the event and systemic analysis. So let's talk about the event overview. So what happened in Los Angeles in 2025? So on June 6, 2025, federal immigration agents conducted operations at several locations in the Los Angeles area, including workplaces and locations where immigrant and Latino workers commonly gathered. Community members began protesting the operations, and confrontations occurred between some protesters and law enforcement officers. The federal response then expanded beyond immigration agents. President Trump ordered members of the California National Guard into Los Angeles without a request from California's governor or Los Angeles officials. The deployment eventually involved thousands of National Guard members and approximately 700 Marines. 700. This military presence was controversial, obviously, because state and local officials argued that existing law enforcement agencies were capable of responding to the protests and that the further government response was not needed. The California Governor's Office reported that the LA Police Department had not requested National Guard assistance and stated that local law enforcement was already managing the situation, like I said. However, I want to make it clear that my presentation is not primarily about whether every protest action was peaceful or lawful. My focus, rather, is on the crisis experienced by immigrant communities before, during, and after the protests. The enforcement operations did not end after one day. The Los Angeles Rapid Response Network documented 471 confirmed enforcement actions between June 6th and July 20th of 2025 and explained that this represented only a sample of total activity in the region. Therefore, families were not responding to one isolated event. They were responding to a continuing and unpredictable threat. And this is something that we saw in Massachusetts recently as well. And Minnesota, where Renee Good and Alex Preddy were murdered. So now we're going to get into why this event constitutes a crisis. This is more than just an enforcement operation. So a crisis occurs when a stressful event overwhelms a person's or community's usual methods of coping and creates significant instability, danger, or disruption in functioning. I like to constitute a crisis similarly. I like to also add that it occurs when like an individual or a community runs out of resources themselves and now has to extend to other places or supports. So the Los Angeles immigration raids fit this definition of a crisis because many people suddenly face the possibility of detention, deportation, family separation, job loss, or loss of a primary caregiver. For someone directly detained, the crisis might involve not knowing where they were being taken, whether they could contact an attorney, what would happen to their children, or whether they would be able to even return home. For family members, it might involve suddenly losing income, transportation, childcare, housing stability, or access to important documents. Children might even be returning home from school and discover that a parent had been detained while they were there. A spouse might not know where their partner was being held. A family might be unable to pay rent because the main wage earner was arrested or became afraid to return to work. This is absolutely a crisis at every level. However, the crisis extended beyond people who were actually detained. Residents who believed that they could be targeted because of their language, appearance, occupation, or neighborhood could begin avoiding schools, healthcare facilities, stores, public transportation, workplaces, and government services. This changed the daily life of everyone involved. Research from immigration raids in California's Central Valley provides an example of the spillover effect. That study found that daily student absences increased by approximately 22% following enforcement activity, with particularly large increases among younger children. Although that study examined a different region of California, it demonstrates how immigration enforcement can disrupt an entire school community rather than only the families directly arrested. Now we're going to move into primary and secondary populations. So the primary victims and survivors included, obviously, individuals who were stopped, questioned, arrested, or detained during the operations. Many of these people were low-wage workers, including day laborers and people working in industries such as construction, car washing, clothing production, domestic work, landscaping, and food service. Some people may have had undocumented status, while others may have had pending immigration cases, lawful status, or even a full-blown United States citizenship. It did not matter. They discriminated against these people, but when it came to the citizenship, they did not. This distinction is important, though, because a person's perceived ethnicity or occupation does not reveal their legal status, like I just said. The secondary affected population was much larger. It was really that spillover effect that I talked about on the last slide. So this included spouses, partners, children, parents, extended relatives, employers, coworkers, classmates, teachers, social service providers, legal advocates, and entire neighborhoods. Mixed status families were especially vulnerable. A single household may include an undocumented parent, a lawful permanent resident, a child with temporary immigration protection, and children who are U.S. citizens. But when one family member is detained, every member of the household may experience the consequences. People with disabilities were also at increased risk. Someone with an intellectual, developmental, psychiatric, sensory, or physical disability may have difficulty understanding commands, explaining what they need, accessing medication, or communicating with officials. Families may also lose a caregiver who assists a disabled child or adult with daily functioning. Therefore, the affected population cannot be reduced to the category of just undocumented immigrants. The crisis spread across families and institutions regardless of individual citizenship status. Next, we get into intersectional and structural factors. So, as most things, especially social crises, this did not affect everyone equally. The crisis occurred within existing systems of racism, xenophobia, classism, ableism, and economic inequality. First, racism and xenophobia shaped who was perceived as a suspicion, like we've discussed previously. A lawsuit filed following the raids alleged that federal agents conducted stops based on factors such as apparent Latino ethnicity, speaking Spanish or accented English, being present at particular workplaces, and performing certain types of labor. The lawsuit also challenged warrantless arrest, detention conditions, and barriers to legal counsel. These were legal allegations rather than proof that every enforcement encounter occurred in the same way. However, with that being said, they definitely raised serious constitutional and human rights concerns. Second, classism shaped people's exposure to enforcement. A person working remotely from a private home faced much different risks than someone waiting for work at a bus stop, working outdoors, selling goods on the street, or gathering near a home improvement store. Low-wage workers were also less likely to have paid leave, savings, private legal representation, flexible transportation, or the ability to remain home without losing essential income. Third, immigration status created an extreme imbalance of power. Like I said, even when people have legal rights or legal citizenship, Fear of detention or deportation can prevent them from asserting those rights, understandably so. Finally, last but not least, I should say, language and disability barriers affected people's ability to respond. Written legal information is not meaningful when it's only available in English, when it's only available online, or when it's written at an inaccessible reading level. Similarly, instructions are not accessible when they are not available in large print, caption formats, sign language, audio formats, or plain language. So this can affect people with disabilities that already have a hard time communicating in English. It can also affect people that have a hard time communicating in English because English is not their first language. So the raids did not enter a community in which everyone possessed equal resources. They entered communities that were already very well shaped by unequal access to money, to legal power, political influence, healthcare, transportation, so on and so forth. Now we'll be getting into the theoretical and crisis model application of this crisis. So the crisis intervention framework I'm going to be using is the Roberts 7-stage crisis intervention model. So I chose this because it provides a clear structure for moving from immediate safety at the bottom of this pyramid to stabilization, and then all the way at the top we see follow-up. So first, I'm going to go through the 7 stages. Sorry. So first, you're gonna conduct a thorough safety and biopsychosocial assessment. Then, it's important to establish rapport with the individual or individuals and a collaborative relationship. Then, it's important to identify the major problems or crisis precipitants. Fourth, explore feelings and emotions. Number 5, generate and explore alternatives. That includes coping strategies. 6th, develop and implement an action plan. So how are you going to move forward from here? And 7th, establish some follow-up. Because it's absolutely important to have that, we have this plan, and now this is what's going to happen when we carry out this plan. Let's check in the future. And like I have on the slide, the stages are absolutely structured one by one, but they absolutely may overlap as circumstances change. It is not an end-all be-all. So, like I said, if they overlap, the social worker may need to return to an earlier stage if these circumstances change. So it is not as clear-cut as this. The flexibility in the overlap and returning to earlier stages if needed is very important, though, because in an immigration-related crisis, especially, the external threat may be ongoing. Like, we are still seeing ICE raids today, obviously in different cities, just more than just LA, but they're still happening a year later. So a family may initially become stabilized and then experience another crisis when a court date is scheduled, a detained relative is transferred, income runs out, or a child's caregiver arrangement changes. So again, these external threats may be ongoing. It may not look like another ICE raid, for example. It may look like other things that kind of resulted from that initial raid. The goal is not to convince the family that the situation is now safe. Rather, it is to help them regain as much safety, control, and functioning as possible while keeping it honest and honestly acknowledging that continued external risk. So we're going to look a little bit more closely at this 7-stage model. So stages 1 through 3, we're going to start with, this is safety, engagement, and assessment. So for an affected family, in the first stage, assessing safety, I would begin by determining whether anyone is currently detained, missing, injured, or without medication, or if they're at risk of losing housing. I would assess whether children or dependent adults have a safe caregiver and whether the family has food, transportation, communication, and access to essential documents. That's huge, especially in an immigration-related crisis. A standard assessment of suicidality, self-harm, interpersonal violence, exploitation, and medical risk would still absolutely be necessary here. However, it should be conducted in a way that does not treat fear of immigration enforcement as irrational. In this context, fear may absolutely be a realistic response to an actual threat. So making sure to go in it with, as we all want to do in all situations, trauma-informed care, trauma-informed practice. The second stage is establishing rapport. So the social worker here should clearly explain their role, confidentiality, its limits, and what information will be documented. The family should be allowed to choose the language in which services are provided. Professional interpreters or trusted cultural brokers should be used instead of automatically relying on children to interpret adult legal or crisis information. The worker should also avoid requesting immigration status information unless it is genuinely necessary for a particular referral, because collecting this unnecessary information can obviously increase fear and potentially even expose the family to additional risk. The third stage is identifying the major problems. Professionals might assume that locating an immigration attorney is the first priority. The family, however, may identify medication, childcare, rent, food, basic survival, or contacting a relative even as more urgent than this. Therefore, the family should be defining the priorities. Crisis intervention is something that's collaborative and not something done to passive recipients. We do not go and tell them what they need, they tell us. Okay, now we're going to move on to stages 4 through 7, which focus more on coping and stabilization. So the fourth stage involves exploring feelings and emotions. After something like this, people will very, very likely and very validly experience things like fear, anger, grief, helplessness, etc. Parents may feel guilty that their children are afraid. Children may believe that they've caused a parent's disappearance or worry that every separation will become permanent. This can absolutely be an extremely traumatizing event or events. The social worker can validate these emotions without turning an understandable response to state action into an The social worker can validate these emotions without turning an understandable response to state action into an individual psychiatric disorder. So instead of jumping to that conclusion, like this is going to be a long-term thing, understand the trauma, understand what they just went through. So the fifth stage is generating alternatives. So possible resources might include legal assistance, emergency childcare, food delivery, transportation, rent assistance, school support, or contact with a rapid response network. The social worker should present realistic options as well as explain the benefits and risks of each and allow the family to decide which options feel safest, again, instead of choosing for them. Then the sixth stage is developing an action plan. So this plan should be specific and manageable and measurable. It might identify what needs to happen within the next few hours, what can wait until the following day, who will make each call, and what information can be safely shared. People that you're working with should feel like they can do it. They should know what they need to do, and they should feel like it is attainable. For example, one person in the family might contact a legal organization, another might go retrieve some medication, and the social worker themselves might coordinate emergency food and childcare. The seventh and final stage is follow-up. Follow-up, like I said before, is especially important because detention and immigration proceedings may last for months. The family may experience repeated transitions, including transfers between detention facilities, court decisions, lost employment, housing instability, reunification, or further deportation. A single crisis appointment would not be an adequate response to an ongoing structural crisis. So now we're moving to community level assessment. Assessment must extend beyond individuals. So Robert's model is often discussed in relation to individuals, but the assessment process can also be applied at the community level. At the meso and macro levels, social workers should assess patterns such as school absences, lost income, caregiver disruption, requests for food assistance, demands for legal services, and avoidance of healthcare or public benefits. They should also map which neighborhoods are experiencing enforcement activity and determine whether resources are distributed in those areas. An assessment should identify language needs, disability access needs, transportation barriers, misinformation, and gaps in internet access. However, with this being said, it should also examine community strength. Immigrant communities are not simply collections of traumatized individuals waiting for professionals to rescue them. They may already have a lot of networks and communities. The Los Angeles Unified School District's We Are One initiative provides multilingual immigration-related resources and states that district sites should support students and families regardless of immigration status. A culturally responsive assessment should therefore ask not only what is missing, but also what is already working and how can formal systems support it without taking full control of it. All right, now we're going to move into DEIA and human rights critique. The crisis obviously threatened several fundamental human rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes rights related to liberty and personal security, equal protection, freedom from arbitrary arrest, privacy and family life, and an adequate standard of living and education. In this crisis, the right to personal safety was threatened when people feared sudden arrest or forceful encounters. The right to family unity was threatened when parents, partners, and caregivers were removed without families having a clear plan or immediate information. Due process concerns arose around allegations of warrantless arrests, suspicionless stops, detention conditions, and denial of timely access to legal counsel. In July of 2025, a federal district court temporarily restricted certain enforcement practices after concluding that plaintiffs were likely to succeed on claims involving unreasonable stops and denial of attorney access. The federal government appealed, and in September of 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court stayed part of the lower court's order while the litigation continued. This legal history is essential because it demonstrates that the rights concerns were not merely theoretical, they became subject of major federal litigation. However, a human rights analysis is broader than asking whether conduct is ultimately ruled unconstitutional. Social workers must also ask whether people were treated with dignity, whether families could obtain information, and whether the response caused preventable harm. Accessibility and inclusion gaps. Who may be excluded from this response? We have language access. And like I said earlier, emergency information may be available in English and Spanish, but not in all indigenous languages. Not in Asian languages, Arabic, Haitian Creole, or other languages used within LA communities. And we have digital access. That might be another barrier. Physical accessibility must be considered. Like a centralized legal clinic may be inaccessible to someone who uses a wheelchair, for example. Information should be accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing, blind or visually impaired, have intellectual, cognitive, or developmental disabilities. Certain groups may also experience additional barriers, such as LGBTQ+ immigrants. They may not feel safe seeking help through family or religious organizations. Survivors of DV or trafficking may have immigration concerns connected to an abusive partner or employer. Some families may avoid shelters, hospitals, police, or government-funded programs because they fear their information will be shared. An inclusive response cannot simply create one hotline and claim that everyone has equal access to it. Accessibility requires multiple languages, multiple formats, mobile services, trusted locations, and meaningful confidentiality protections. Power and privilege. Who had the power to make decisions? Power influenced who controlled information, movement, and decision-making throughout this crisis. Federal agencies controlled where enforcement operations occurred, who was questioned, where detained people were transported, and when families received any information, and as well as how the media was able to publicly frame the event. On the other end, privilege shaped access to protection. So people with greater resources were more likely to have, were better positioned to protect themselves. They were more likely to have private legal representation, paid leave, financial savings, didn't have to worry about money as much, reliable transportation, English fluency, knowledge of legal rights, secure housing, and access to documentation. Low-wage immigrant workers who often face a choice between going to work and risking enforcement or remaining home and losing essential income. They were placed in a situation that was absolutely a catch-22. I am speeding up towards the end here, just because I don't want it to go too much over 30 if I have to. But now we're going to the proposed culturally responsive intervention plan. At the micro level, the intervention would begin with immediate stabilization. So social workers would assess safety, caregiver arrangements, medication, food, housing, transportation, etc. And then with the family's consent, the social worker could connect them with a qualified immigration attorney or legal services organization. Emergency practical support is just as important as emotional support. So crisis counseling will have limited value when the family does not have food or does not know who will pick up a child from school. Like we said in the the 7 stages. It is important, and even the basic, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You want to establish the basic survival needs before anything else. Services should be available in the family's preferred language, should include choices about where and how meetings occur. The family should also create a preparedness plan. This might include emergency contacts, authorized caregivers, document storage, instructions about finances, etc. However, it should not be framed as preparing people to accept deportation. It's a tool for increasing control under uncertain circumstances. So meso-level interventions include collaboration with schools, workplaces, and communities. So social workers should coordinate with these communities. One component would include multilingual rapid response teams, which could verify reported enforcement activity, distribute accurate information, connect families to attorneys, and reduce the spread of rumors. And schools absolutely need specific protocols for children whose caregivers are detained. Staff should know who may legally pick up the child, how to contact emergency caregivers, how to protect confidential information, and how to respond to a child experiencing acute distress, or how to contact someone that knows how to better respond. Support groups could be offered separately for children, teenagers, caregivers, and workers. Those groups should focus on stabilization, connection, coping, practical resource, and reducing isolation. Community organizations could also organize food delivery, transportation, emergency cash assistance, and accompaniment to legal appointments. These efforts should not require people to repeatedly disclose traumatic details or prove that they're deserving of them. The assistance should be low barrier, confidential, and available regardless of whether a person has formal documentation of the crisis. At a macro level, social workers should advocate for policy and institutional change. These include protections against racial profiling, meaningful access to legal counsel, transparent systems for locating detained individuals, humane detention conditions, and independent oversight of enforcement practices. All crisis communication should meet language and disability access standards. Schools, healthcare facilities, DV programs, shelters, and places of worship should have clear procedures for responding to immigration enforcement while protecting confidential information and complying with the law. Emergency funding should be provided to families that lose income or caregivers because of detention. Worker protections are also absolutely necessary because fear of immigration enforcement can increase vulnerability to wage theft, unsafe conditions, harassment, and exploitation. We see this all the time. Finally, public agencies should collect data about family separation, school disruption, disability needs, housing instability, detention conditions, and unmet legal needs. Without this accurate data, the harm remains invisible, and institutions can continue to treat each family's crisis as an isolated personal problem rather than part of a broader structural pattern. It's absolutely essential, that data collection. All right. A couple more slides here. We want to move into anti-oppressive and trauma-informed practice. Like I've been saying for most of this presentation, we want to move away from that paternalistic intervention. So instead of asking, what do professionals believe this family needs? We want to ask, what does this family identify as urgent, and what barriers must be removed for them to receive the support? So, as we know, the 5 pillars: safety, trust, collaboration, choice, empowerment. We have those, and we also want to add cultural context here. We don't want to just help. We don't want to focus on just helping people manage their emotional responses and throw a Band-Aid on it. We also want to identify the systems producing this trauma. So an anti-oppressive approach would reject the idea that professionals should enter community and decide what people need and control the resources. Instead, affected people should absolutely have decision-making power. They should be included in planning, in evaluation, outreach, leadership, and they should be compensated for that labor, 100%. Distrust may be a rational response when institutions have historically harmed, surveilled, excluded, or failed the community, and making decisions for these families may absolutely add to that distrust. And families should have genuine options. They should be able to decline a referral, choose a different provider, request an interpreter, bring a support person, or decide that a particular service feels unsafe at any time, even if they agree to it to begin with. The goal is not to make the family dependent on the social worker. It is to increase access to resources while respecting the family's existing knowledge, relationships, and capacity. Social workers should absolutely partner with organizations that are already doing the work and that are already trusted by immigrant communities. That's huge. One major partner would be the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. They provide organizing, legal resources, know your rights education, and immigration enforcement preparedness information. The Los Angeles Raids Rapid Response Network is a collaboration involving immigrant, faith, labor, legal, community, and LGBTQIA+ organizations. This network connects people affected by enforcement with legal support and community resources. It was originally established in response to earlier factory and workplace raids, meaning it entered the 2025 crisis with existing knowledge and community relationships. Other partners could include worker centers, neighborhood mutual aid groups, culturally specific mental health providers, schools, community clinics, etc., etc. Partnership does not mean using grassroots organizations only as referral sites while formal agencies retain control and funding. Social workers and agencies should share resources, follow community leadership, compensate cultural brokers, and avoid duplicating programs that already exist. Mutual aid should be recognized as a legitimate form of crisis response, grounded in reciprocity and community knowledge, rather than viewed as an informal substitute for professional intervention. In conclusion, some takeaways. The June 2025 LA immigration raids created a crisis extending far beyond the individuals who were directly detained. The operations affected families, children, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and community organizations. The impact was intensified by racism, xenophobia, class inequality, language barriers, ableism, and unequal access to legal power. Robert's seven-stage crisis intervention model offers a useful structure for assessing safety, identifying priorities, exploring coping, creating an action plan, and maintaining follow-up. However, it must be applied in a way that recognizes the source of the crisis, and that is it is not only internal or psychological, but rather also institutional and structural. Therefore, an effective response must operate at multiple levels. It should stabilize individuals and families, strengthen community systems, and challenge policies and practices that create preventable harm. Social workers should not only help people cope with systems that create fear and instability, we also have a responsibility to question those systems, redistribute power, and advocate for the fundamental rights of the people affected. Here are my references. Thank you guys so much for listening.